My 5-year-old stopped breathing on my parents' front porch while my father stood on the other side of the door. I need you to hold on to a single word before I tell you anything else. It's a word my father used that night through the wood in his regular speaking voice. Drama. I've heard him use that word dozens of times over the years. I need you to notice, as we go, every place it appears in this story, because by the time I'm done, that word is going to mean something completely different to you than it does right now. The car that saved us came from 40 minutes away, without being called, at the exact moment I had run out of every other option. I'm going to tell you who sent for it, and what that reveals about every single person in the story. But first, you need to know who Raphael was. Nothing else makes sense without him. Raphael Harris was born in late October and had one question that covered almost everything by the time he was 2. But why, Mama? He asked it about weather and arithmetic and how fish breathed underwater and why certain people at church embraced certain children and walked directly past others. That last one I answered too quickly. I've thought about that answer on a lot of nights since. By 5, he was the kind of child who remembered the names of servers who'd brought him food and said thank you without being told, because it genuinely seemed to occur to him each time that people deserved to be thanked for the things they did. He slept with a stuffed fox named Rusty, who'd been through the washing machine so many times his fur had gone from orange to something close to pale cream. He carried Rusty everywhere, including every hospital visit, which happened often enough that we had a full routine around it. Go bag pre-packed, inhalers in 4 locations, action plan memorized cold. He had asthma the way he had brown eyes, without complaint, without ever once using it as an entry point for sympathy. He was obsessed with herbivore dinosaurs because, as he explained with complete solemn authority, they minded their own business and didn't bother anyone. He once spent 20 minutes explaining to Rusty, with hand-drawn diagrams, why the Stegosaurus was specifically underrated. The fox appeared unconvinced. Raphael considered the matter settled regardless. The Saturday before his 6th birthday, he and Jonathan sat at the kitchen table for an hour and 40 minutes playing checkers. Raphael lost every game. He refused to stop playing. He also refused to accept that he'd lost any of them. Jonathan disappeared into the kitchen 3 separate times just to have somewhere private to laugh. He told me about it later with the particular helpless expression that only Raphael could produce in him. I am including both of those memories here for no reason except that they are true, and I want you to have them. On a drive home from my parents' house when he was 3.5, he was quiet in the back seat for a long time. That meant he'd been holding something. Then he asked it in the particular careful voice he used for questions he'd been rehearsing. Mama, did Grandpa forget I was his? I turned the radio down. I told him Grandpa was just quiet, that some people showed love in ways that were harder to see. He said okay, and looked back out the window and let me change the subject without making it difficult. He always let me change the subject. He was consistently more considerate of my feelings than I was of his reality. He asked it again later. I'm going to tell you what I said the second time. But you need to understand who my father was first, because that answer only lands when you have the full picture of what I'd spent 5 years protecting. My father, Gerald, had been a church deacon for nearly 2 decades. His signature, the sentence that came up whenever anyone described him to someone who didn't know him yet, was, "My door is always open." He said it at church events, at block association meetings, at community fundraisers, at every gathering that presented an occasion for it. My mother, Suzanne, coordinated the neighborhood emergency meal train, the network that organized food and support for families dealing with sudden illness, unexpected crisis, the things that arrive without warning and require a community to absorb. She ran it with genuine organizational skill and what I believed, for a very long time, was genuine care. I believed the public face was the private one. That belief is the single most expensive mistake I made as a mother, and I made it consistently for 5 years. My sister Augustina had married William, who works in finance, and their twin boys Cameron and Cole were my parents' celebrated grandsons, in a way that wasn't subtle once I started looking at it directly. Real birthday parties at the house, with cakes from bakeries and the right gifts for the right children. Raphael's birthdays came 2 weeks after the twins, and they arrived with cards that were usually a few days late, sometimes containing a gift card. And one year, he was 4. A 3-pack of ankle socks still in the packaging with the retail sticker on. He carried those socks to show me like they were something remarkable. I stood at my kitchen counter and held onto the edge of it. I told myself I was going to say something to someone about what I was watching happen. Then I didn't. Saying something felt like a war I didn't have the energy to start, and I kept telling myself that keeping the peace was protecting Raphael. I was protecting the wrong people. Gerald had never once hugged Raphael in 5 years. Not at Christmas, not at Easter, not at any ordinary Sunday. He hugged Cameron and Cole every visit. Both arms, the embrace that communicates without language. You belong to me, and I am glad you exist. Raphael received a nod. Sometimes a brief shoulder pat, the kind you give a professional acquaintance you won't see again for a few months. Raphael noticed. I know because at 3.5 he asked me about it from the back seat, and at every subsequent family visit I watched him come through the door and glance briefly in Gerald's direction. Just a flicker. Just checking. And I watched my father's attention go somewhere else. And I watched Raphael file it without comment and go find the cousins. He did that every single visit. He eventually stopped glancing. I don't know if that was adjustment or something worse. I've decided to stop making myself think about it too carefully. Christmas, the twins received tablets. Raphael assembled a 50-piece puzzle of a cartoon dog he had never once expressed interest in, piece by methodical piece, while his cousins unboxed their screens. When he finished, he held it up and said, "I made it, Mama," with nothing in his face but genuine pride in the task he'd completed. He was 4. He didn't yet know what he was being told. I did. I sat beside him on that floor and thought about saying something, and then the table was called, and I said nothing. He drew his family a few weeks later at school. The drawing came home labeled "My Family." Every figure was holding hands, except one standing slightly apart from the group. When I asked who it was, he said, "That's Grandpa. He doesn't like holding hands. He was 4. He had already accepted it as a permanent and unchangeable feature of the world, the way he accepted that some trees kept their leaves and some didn't. About a month before the emergency, Raphael had a small coughing spell at the dinner table. Nothing requiring action, the kind that came and went in under a minute. I watched Gerald watch it for about 4 seconds, and then my father said something to Suzanne in a voice low enough that he may not have intended me to hear. Always something with that kid's drama. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the tone of someone noting that a category of event had occurred again. I looked at Raphael. He was taking a sip of water and looking at his plate, who may or may not have heard it. And either way was absorbing it the way he absorbed everything. Quietly, without reaction, with the particular practiced ease of a child who has learned not to make his responses too visible. I cleared the plates after dinner and I thought, I need to say something. I didn't say anything. And a month later, through a closed door, "Don't bring that drama into my house before I tell you what happened on October 6th. I need you to hold 3 things. Don't put them down." Each one was sitting in plain sight for years before I understood what I was looking at. The first, a small cloth-bound notebook with dates and names in my father's handwriting that Raphael handed to me in a garage thinking it was a story. The second, the night Diane turned into that driveway, there was a text on her phone that had been sent before she had any reason to be on that road. I found out about him months later. When I found out who sent it, I had to sit down. The third, I found something buried 4 years deep in my own voicemail archive, in my father's voice, using a sentence I'd heard him say at every community event for 20 years. But meaning something completely different than any of those times. All 3 of these were already in the story before I understood they were evidence. All 3 of them were right there the whole time. Raphael had a scratchy throat the night before. I gave him the antihistamine, checked his breathing, found it clear and steady, kissed him goodnight while he held Rusty. He said, "Mama, do you think if I asked Grandpa to teach me chess, he'd say yes?" I told him I thought Grandpa would love that. I woke up at 3:47 in the morning to the sound every parent of an asthmatic child keeps somewhere at the back of their mind at all times. A high, thin whistle, airways closing fast. Raphael was sitting up in his bed with one hand pressed flat against his chest, Rusty under his other arm, his face the particular gray I had learned over 5 years to recognize as the threshold between manageable and something else. Jonathan was on a night shift 40 minutes away. I grabbed the go bag, my keys, and my son. I drove toward my parents' house, 8 minutes closer to the hospital, the house with the door that was always open. I was pounding with my fist and calling his name. And then at some point, I stopped calling his name and just said, "Please," because Raphael had gone still against my shoulder and I had run out of strategy. My father's voice came through the wood. Not urgent, not the voice of someone being woken unexpectedly. His regular voice, using the word. Don't bring that drama into my house. My mother's voice came through behind his, call someone else. And then there were headlights in the driveway. A dark blue sedan I recognized by engine sound. My father's sister, Diane, who lived 40 minutes away, who had arrived, without being called, at the exact moment I had run out of every other option. She was out of the car before it stopped moving. She didn't ask me to explain anything. She took Raphael, got him settled in the back seat, looked at my parents' house for exactly 3 seconds as the motion sensor light clicked on and lit up the figure at the side light window. One hand pressed flat against the glass, watching, not moving. Then she got in the driver's seat and said, "Navigate, I'll drive." And she drove. 2 words she said in the driveway, as she crossed toward me and saw my father's shape at that window. Not to me, not loudly. Just stated to the cold air, "Not again." I heard it. I didn't ask what it meant. I had a child who needed a hospital. I'll come back to those 2 words. And when I do, they're going to reframe something important about everything you just watched happen. Raphael's airways were open in 20 minutes. He slept eventually with the IV in his arm and Rusty under his chin, his chest finally rising in the slow, even pattern I had spent the last hour desperate to see. I sat in the chair beside him, and the question I had been outrunning started to form. Not why did they lock the door? The question underneath that one. The word drama kept surfacing. I kept hearing it in different registers. The dinner table, the family barbecue, the month before the emergency, and then through the wood of the door. And I kept noticing that the word moved through those memories with a consistency I hadn't been registering. Like a thread I'd been stepping over for years, without ever bending down to look at what it was attached to. Then, Jonathan arrived. He came through the hospital door just after 5 in the morning, still in his work clothes. When I told him what had happened at that door, his face moved through several expressions and landed on a stillness I recognized as the outermost boundary of his control. He sat on the edge of the cot beside Raphael and placed his hand on Raphael's foot without waking him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to tell you something I've been carrying since Raphael was 3 months old. I made a decision not to tell you then, and I've been wrong about that decision ever since." Gerald had called Jonathan when Raphael was 3 months old, not to welcome him, not for any purpose Jonathan had expected. Gerald had called to make an offer. If Jonathan was willing to step back from the marriage voluntarily, the family would make sure Raphael was taken care of properly. Step back voluntarily. Take care of Raphael properly. Jonathan had said no, had hung up, and had never once told me. He'd decided it was his to carry because he thought telling me would break something between me and my parents that couldn't be rebuilt. He'd been wrong about that. And he knew he'd been wrong, and now he was putting it down. I sat in that hospital chair and let the phone call land. And what it landed on wasn't just itself, it landed on everything else. On the timeline it created. Gerald had made that offer when Raphael was 3 months old. Jonathan refused. And from that point forward, not before the refusal, after, the treatment of Raphael had taken the specific and consistent shape that it took. I thought about the nods instead of hugs. I thought about always something with that kid's drama. Sat at a dinner table with Raphael sitting right there. I thought about don't bring that drama into my house. And what I thought was, the word was never about Raphael. Gerald had been using that word to describe Jonathan's world for years. And Raphael had been filed into Jonathan's world from the time he was 3 months old. The door that closed on October 6th had been under construction since then. I want to be precise about this, because the full picture only becomes visible when you say it plainly. Raphael wasn't the target. Raphael was the mechanism. Every cold gesture, every absent hug, every late birthday card, every ankle sock, every "that's their drama" muttered at the dinner table. Each one was a data point in a message Gerald had been delivering to Jonathan, and through Jonathan to me. This is what you chose. This is the cost of it. Change your answer, and the cost changes. My son, who had asked from the backseat of a car whether Grandpa forgot he was his, had been that mechanism since he was 3 months old. That is the truest and most specific version of what happened in this family. It took me 5 years, a locked door, and a hospital waiting room at 5 in the morning to finally look at it directly. 3 days after the emergency, Diane sat at my kitchen table and gave me fragments without interpretation. A comment Gerald had made years earlier. If Renee keeps choosing Jonathan, we manage this differently. Dates that lined up with incidents I already knew. a word she'd heard him use. She didn't tell me what to make of it. She just put it alongside what Jonathan had already told me. And then there was the notebook. The notebook. Raphael handed it to me in the garage thinking it was a journal, because he saw handwriting inside and assumed story. It was my father's handwriting throughout. Dates going back 4 years. Jonathan's name appearing frequently in notes Gerald described as stability indicators, about employment, about what he called consistency of position. Headers appeared across sections, interventions, family alignment, recurring phrases, after certain dated entries, a single word at the bottom, progress or no progress. One entry stopped me completely. It was dated 18 months before the emergency, and it read, Raphael responded well, shows awareness of environment. I stared at it for a long time, thinking it was something different from what it was. I thought, maybe there was a softening here. Maybe he was trying. Maybe this was a note about paying attention, about affection, finding a new form. It wasn't until I read the entry directly before it, dated the same week Raphael had been in the hospital and Gerald had not called, had not checked, had asked nothing, that I understood what responded well meant. He wasn't documenting care. He was documenting that Raphael had stopped asking about him. Responded well to the absence. Shows awareness of environment. My 5-year-old had learned not to expect anything, and my father had written it down as progress. I read it 3 times on the garage floor with Raphael beside me. Then I put the notebook in my bag. The voicemail. I found it myself. I want you to know this because I don't want you to come away from this story thinking the mother was passive while everyone else did the work. I was going through 4 years of saved voicemails, every record I could access. When I found one from Gerald, dated 4 years before the emergency, I pressed play and heard his voice. The particular measured warmth he used at community events. Renee, your mother and I have been talking. Jonathan's situation hasn't looked stable for a while. We've been thinking about you. You know our door is always open. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. I listened to it twice. I listened to our door is always open. I had heard those words at church gatherings, neighborhood meetings, and community dinners for my entire life. And 4 years before he locked that door against his grandson's face, my father had put them in a voicemail to me as an invitation to leave my husband. An open door to an alternative. And when I kept choosing not to walk through it, when I kept choosing Jonathan, the door that had always been metaphorical became, on October 6th, something literal and closed. He hadn't made that choice in a moment of panic. He had been building it for years. The door Raphael was turned away from had been under construction since the month my son was born. Gerald did not go quiet when word reached him that the deacon board had been convened. Within 48 hours, the campaign was moving. His mother's sister first, 2 deacons closest to him, then Augustina, then 3 neighbors who'd known our family long enough to have loyalty in the question. The account was organized, distributed, and spreading faster than I could track it. I had panicked. Raphael had not been in the danger I was representing. He and Suzanne hadn't understood the severity because I hadn't communicated it calmly. Diane had a history of complicating family situations, and her account was colored by long-standing tension over the trust. He used the word exaggerated multiple times. He used the phrase emotional state when describing me. He did not once acknowledge the door. Within a week, it was working. One of the deacons Gerald had called was already seated on the panel Pastor Terrence was assembling. He asked for more time. Augustina called me, not to relay talking points, but to warn me, her voice pitched low. And I could hear in it that she was scared both for me and about the position it left her in. 2 neighbors Suzanne had cooked for over many years were not prepared to disbelieve her. History outweighs newcomer testimony in close communities, and her history with them was long and warm and clean. And then a neighbor I'd known since I was 11 years old sat with me in my kitchen and told me gently, with genuine concern in her voice, that she hoped I was taking care of myself. That grief did things to our minds, that sometimes we looked for reasons when there weren't any. She meant it kindly. That was the worst part. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the notebook in front of me and the voicemail on my phone, and I thought, what if this isn't enough? What if 20 years of a reputation he built specifically for moments like this one is more than these 3 things can move? He had spent 2 decades becoming the man whose door was always open. He knew exactly what he'd built. He knew exactly how to deploy it. For about 2 weeks, I genuinely did not know which version of events was going to settle as the story this community ended up carrying. What ended it was not a single confrontation. Diane brought the notebook to the trust's legal advisor. Diane and I brought the voicemail to Pastor Terrence together that same week, alongside the trust attorney's preliminary findings. Gerald's counter-campaign stopped within 72 hours. He knew what the notebook was. He knew what the voicemail was. He went quiet in the way someone goes quiet when they understand that the floor under their story has moved and they don't have the leverage to move it back. The formal consequences are one sentence. The trust's discretionary structure was permanently restructured. Gerald's board role ended. The counter-campaign collapsed. His church position was resigned. Those things happened and they mattered, but they're not what I think about. What I think about is the letter. Gerald wrote me a letter after the consequences landed. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some version of a beginning, an opening, something that at least acknowledged the shape of what he'd done. The letter was organized and specific. It contained a careful accounting of everything Gerald felt had been taken from him, and it closed with a single sentence. I hope someday you'll understand what you've cost this family. Not a word about Raphael. Not a word about a 5-year-old on a porch. After the notebook and the voicemail and the legal findings and the lost position, he sat down to write, and he produced that sentence. The floor of his story had moved. His understanding of what he'd done had not moved at all. I read it once. I put it in the same folder as the notebook, and I decided I didn't need it to. Suzanne's emergency meal train went quiet over the months that followed. The calls to coordinates stopped coming in gradually, without announcement. The phone just went quiet, the way phones go quiet for people whose record is no longer clean all the way down to the bottom. Suzanne mentioned it to Augustina, who mentioned it to me. She said she didn't understand what had changed. I believed her. I think she genuinely didn't know. Suzanne told me something, months after the legal proceedings closed, that I have not known how to put down. She said Gerald had stood at that door for longer than I knew. She said she had watched him touch the handle. He had known we were there. He had known exactly what he was deciding. He had stood there with his hand on the handle, and he had chosen. I don't find that comforting. I find it clarifying, because it means nothing that happened that night was panic or confusion or failure of understanding. Not the door, not the word, not anything. Now the text Diane showed me 4 months after the emergency. There was a message in her phone, timestamped October 6th at 10:47 p.m. 23 minutes before Diane turned into that driveway. The sender was Suzanne. Suzanne who stood behind that door. Suzanne who said call someone else. Suzanne who had participated in 6 years of this without once stepping outside it. The text said, "It's been a while. Are you free to come by tonight? Gerald's watching television. I'll make tea." Now let me tell you what Diane's 2 words meant. She told me eventually. There had been another situation, years before Raphael, in a different part of the family, where she had seen something she knew was wrong, had said nothing, had chosen the easier version of herself, and had spent years carrying what that silence cost. She didn't give me the specifics. It wasn't her story to share. What she told me was that when she felt the pull to stay in the car that night, it was the same feeling she'd had in that prior moment. Recognizable at the cellular level, the feeling of choosing distance in order to stay comfortable. She had learned exactly how heavy that distance became over time. She had decided 3 years before October 6th that she was going to drive over and tell her brother directly that she knew what he was doing and wasn't going to protect it anymore. She'd been postponing it for 3 years. She decided that night was the night. She didn't know she was driving into an emergency. She just knew she was done. And the road happened to be the right road at the right moment. I've thought many times about the version of the story where she postpones it one more time. I don't stay in that version long. About 4 months after the emergency, Raphael started calling Diane Grandma Diane. Not because anyone suggested it, not because we had a conversation about it, or gave him any indication it was available to him. He just started doing it one afternoon the way children adopt language, when a word fits something they already privately know. And he came home from an afternoon at her house and said, "Grandma Diane's cat is named Gerald," which is a very funny name for a cat. I stopped what I was doing. I looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at me. We held completely still, and neither of us corrected him, and Raphael went to find Rusty. The following Saturday, he came home with cornbread knowledge. Grandma Diane had taught him. The secret, he reported with deep and genuine authority, was more butter than you thought was reasonable. I told him that sounded exactly right. I meant it. Gerald found out through a photograph from a holiday gathering at Diane's house. Raphael in the frame holding cornbread, grinning in the particular way he grinned when he was completely at home, with a caption mentioning Grandma Diane's recipe. Gerald called Suzanne. Suzanne called Augustina. Augustina called me to say Gerald was very upset and felt things had gone too far. I sat with the phone in my hand. I thought about the photograph. I thought about a text sent at 10:47 p.m. I thought about a cloth-bound notebook with interventions as a header and a single word at the bottom of entries. And then I thought about Raphael standing at Diane's counter with an apron too big for him, being shown the secret to cornbread, and the specific quality of complete ease in his face. The ease that can't be performed and can't be faked, and that I had been desperately wanting to see in him for 5 years. I put the phone down without answering, and I went to find my son. About 6 months after the emergency, Raphael and I were going through an old photo album. He found a picture from a family dinner 2 years before, everyone at the table, and he pointed at my father in it. He'd asked it once before, from the backseat of the car when he was 3.5. He was 6 now. He asked it in a different voice than the first time, the voice of someone who has been patient with not asking and has decided they've been patient long enough. Mama, did Grandpa forget I was his? I sat with that photograph in my hands. I felt every answer I had available to me and found that none of them were both accurate and fair for a 6-year-old to carry. So I put my arm around him and I said, "You are 100% completely, permanently ours." He thought about that. He said, "I know." He turned the page. I sat there after he moved on. I didn't say anything else. I'm not going to say anything else about it here. Last Christmas, Raphael drew his family. He does this regularly, crayon, everyone labeled, usually gathered somewhere specific. He brought it to me and said, "Look, Mama." Every figure was holding hands. Every person was there, accounted for, present. Grandma Diane was in the center, next to Raphael, holding his hand on one side and Jonathan's on the other. On the other side of me was Rusty, whom Raphael had long since decided counted as family and about whom I was not going to argue with him. Nobody was standing apart from the rest of the group. No figures slightly outside the frame, the way one figure had been outside the frame in a drawing he made at 4 years old and brought home labeled, "My Family." I looked at it for a long time and said, "This is a beautiful picture." He said, "I know," and went back to his dinosaur books. I put it on the refrigerator. It's there right now. Every time I look at it, I think, he drew the family that is actually there, without instructions, without anyone's guidance, without being told who belongs and who doesn't. He is 6 years old. He already knows. Now, Suzanne, call someone else. Through a closed door, in the same voice she used to tell me all her other truths. And also, "It's been a while. Are you free to come by tonight? Oh, Gerald's watching television. I'll make tea." Sent at 10:47 p.m. 23 minutes before the car that saved my son turned into that driveway. Both of those things are real. Both came from the same person. Both exist in the same 15-minute window, with her grandchild's life in the balance on the other side of a door. I've turned it over more times than I can count. I've sat with it in the middle of the night and I have not arrived at a conclusion about what it means. I don't know if Suzanne wanted to be stopped. I don't know if some part of her had spent 6 years looking for a way out of what she'd helped build. I don't know if it was guilt or fear or something more complicated than either that doesn't have a clean name. What I know is that I've stopped requiring people to be simpler than they actually are. I think the irreconcilable part is the truest thing about her in this story. But I'm not asking you what the text meant. I'm asking you something harder. If someone finally wanted to tell you the truth, but only after your child almost died, would hearing them out honor your child? Or betray them? I read every single comment. I want the honest answer, not the easy one. There are no wrong answers here, only what's true for you. If this story reached you, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. There are more conversations coming. And I'll see you in the next one.